The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard, stretching over the uneven grass where we had spent countless summers lying side by side, dreaming of lives that felt just out of reach. The air was thick with the scent of warm earth and cut grass, mingling with the faint, familiar aroma of beer, as condensation dripped lazily from the bottle resting between my fingers. It was the kind of summer heat that clung to your skin, slow and heavy, making even the most fleeting moments feel stretched out, endless. Anna was beside me, propped up on her elbows, her sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose as she gazed up at the sky. She had always carried herself with an effortless kind of confidence, the type that made it easy to follow her lead, to get swept up in her energy. We had been inseparable since high school, bonded by a shared restlessness, an unspoken understanding that we were meant for something beyond the limits of our small town. Despite all our plans, all the wild ideas we had scribbled into notebooks and whispered about under starlit skies, we had ended up here back in the same place we had once sworn we would leave behind. Neither of us talked about it much, about the slow, creeping disappointment of finding ourselves stuck. Instead, we filled our days with distractions, pretending that nothing had changed. We drank cheap beer in my parents' backyard, sprawled out on the lawn, and talked about everything and nothing, searching for ways to make the world feel bigger than it was. The only one who didn't seem to mind the monotony was Max, our family's German shepherd, who lay stretched out in the shade nearby, his tail flicking lazily against the ground. He had been around since we were teenagers, a constant fixture in the background of our memories. There was something comforting about his presence, about the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he watched us with quiet understanding, as if he knew all our secrets. Anna rolled onto her side, propping her head up with one hand as she turned to face me, a sly smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You ever think about doing something totally insane?" she asked, her voice laced with the familiar edge of mischief. I raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of my beer. "Depends on your definition of insane." She laughed, the sound light and teasing, but there was something else in her expression, something unreadable, just beneath the surface. "I mean something that would make people look at you differently. Something that changes the way you see yourself." I smirked, shaking my head. "That sounds dangerously close to self-discovery, and I thought we agreed we weren't doing that." Anna grinned, but she didn't let the question go. She had always had a way of pushing boundaries, of toeing the line between curiosity and recklessness, daring me to step closer with her. It was part of what had drawn me to her in the first place, the way she could make even the most mundane moments feel like the edge of something thrilling, something new. The conversation drifted, meandering like it always did, shifting between old memories and half-formed thoughts, until we lapsed into a comfortable silence. The sun had started its slow descent, casting everything in a golden hue, the air growing cooler, tinged with the promise of evening. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the fading sunlight seep into my skin, listening to the distant hum of cicadas. Anna shifted beside me, sitting up fully now, stretching her arms over her head. "You ever wonder if we're just waiting for something to happen to us?" she asked, her voice quieter this time, more thoughtful. I opened one eye, glancing at her. "Like what?" She shrugged, picking at a loose thread on the hem of her shorts. "I don't know. Something big. Something that snaps us out of this." I thought about it for a moment, about how easy it was to fall into routine, to let the days blend together until you couldn't tell one from the next. I had spent so much time waiting for my life to start, for something to come along and shake me awake. But maybe that was the problem, waiting. Maybe nothing ever really happened unless you made it happen. Maybe we have to make it happen, I said finally. Anna turned to me then, her eyes sharp and knowing, as if she had been waiting for me to say it. She grinned, nudging me with her knee. "Now you're talking." Max let out a soft sigh from his spot in the grass, his ears twitching slightly as he shifted positions. I reached out, scratching behind them absent-mindedly, feeling the familiar softness of his fur beneath my fingers. There was something grounding about it, about the quiet constancy of him, about the way he never seemed to worry about what came next. Anna watched me, her expression unreadable again. "You think he ever gets bored?" she asked, nodding toward Max. I glanced down at him. "I don't think dogs think about things like that." "Maybe not," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Or maybe they just don't care." I thought about that, about what it would be like to exist without the weight of expectation, without the restless feeling that something was always just out of reach. It was a strange thought, imagining a life without wondering what came next. But maybe that was the difference between us and them. Maybe that was why we were always searching. Anna exhaled, flopping back onto the grass, her arms spread out beside her. I just don't want to wake up one day and realize I never did anything interesting, she admitted, staring up at the sky. I watched her for a moment, then turned my gaze upward too. The sky had begun to shift, streaked with oranges and pinks, the first stars just barely visible. The world felt small and endless all at once. "You won't," I said, and I meant it. She turned her head toward me, smiling in that way she always did when she knew she had already won me over. "Neither will you." There. Max let out another soft sigh, rolling onto his back, his paws stretching out in front of him. The moment hung between us, quiet and unspoken, the weight of something just beginning to settle in. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I had the distinct feeling that this was the moment we had been waiting for. Boundaries were always something we toyed with. They weren't hard lines drawn in the sand, fixed and immutable. They were suggestions, invitations to test the edges of what was possible. Anna and I had spent years playing with limits, not just ours, but other people's too. It wasn't about rebellion, not really. It was about curiosity, about the allure of the forbidden, the way stepping just 1 inch beyond what was expected could make the world feel more alive. It started with small things when we were teenagers and still figuring out what it meant to be ourselves. Skipping school just to see if we could. Stealing a pack of cigarettes neither of us really wanted to smoke. Sneaking into places we didn't belong, just for the thrill of being where we shouldn't. It wasn't about breaking rules, not exactly. It was about proving that the rules weren't as solid as people thought they were. There was something exhilarating about watching the world react to transgression. A thrill in seeing the way people's eyes widened when you said the thing you weren't supposed to say, in feeling the rush of adrenaline when you stepped 1 foot too far past the line. We prided ourselves on it, on being the kind of people who weren't afraid to push, to see how far things could bend before they broke. But boundaries aren't just societal. They aren't just the rules imposed by parents or schools or laws. The most interesting boundaries are the invisible ones, the ones that exist only because we decide they do. The ones between comfort and discomfort, between what we allow ourselves to feel and what we don't. Those were the lines we were most fascinated by. The ones that existed inside us. Anna was always better at pushing those than I was. She had a way of asking questions that made you uncomfortable, not because they were cruel, but because they forced you to look at things you hadn't examined before. She liked to see how far people would go, how much they would admit to, how easily she could get them to step beyond themselves. "Ever wonder why we stop ourselves from doing things we want to do?" she asked me once, when we were lying on the floor of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling. I turned my head to look at her. "Because some things are wrong." She smiled, but it wasn't amusement. It was something sharper, more thoughtful. But who decides that? Who decides what's too far and what's just unexplored? I didn't have an answer. Not then. But it stayed with me. That question, where do we draw the line? And why? Followed us through the years, growing with us, shifting with our experiences. We tested it in conversations, in the choices we made, in the things we dared each other to do. It was never about hurting anyone, never about destruction. It was about seeing how much freedom we actually had, about learning where the real limits were. The problem with playing that game is that sometimes you don't realize when you've gone too far. Sometimes the line is so blurry that by the time you recognize you've crossed it, it's already behind you, and there's no way to step back. That summer, the one where we found ourselves trapped in our hometown, lost between the people we used to be and the people we were supposed to become, was the summer we ran out of boundaries to push. We had done it all, or at least it felt like we had. There were no more dares that felt exciting, no more rules we hadn't already questioned. We were running out of ways to make the world feel alive. And that was when the real tests began. Not the ones about what we could get away with. Not the ones about how far we could go without getting caught. The ones about ourselves. What if we did something that actually scared us? Anna asked one afternoon, as we sat on my back porch, drinking beers that had long since gone warm in the sun. I laughed. "Like what?" She tilted her head, watching me. "Like something we'd never be able to take back." I felt the shift in the air, the weight of something unspoken pressing against my ribs. "Isn't that the whole point of boundaries?" I asked, half joking, half serious. "So we don't cross the ones that matter." Anna smiled, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. "Maybe we're wrong about what matters." I looked away, watching Max stretch out on the grass, his tail flicking lazily. He didn't understand lines or limits. He lived purely in the present, responding to the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. Maybe that was the difference between us and them. Maybe that was why humans had boundaries in the first place, because we knew what it meant to regret. The thing about playing with boundaries is that, eventually you either stop pushing or you push too far. And once you cross a line you weren't meant to cross, there's no way to pretend it didn't happen. I didn't know then that we were already past the point of no return. I just knew that. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know how far we could go. The world had always felt too small in that town. It wasn't just the familiar streets or the way everyone knew each other's names. It was the weight of expectation, the silent pressure that pressed against the ribs, a reminder that this was all there was, all there ever would be. Anna and I had spent years trying to push against it, to stretch the edges of our existence into something bigger, something more meaningful. But no matter what we did, no matter how far we tried to run, we always ended up back here. Back in the same places, having the same conversations, watching the same sunsets fade into the same predictable darkness. There were reasons for this. Reasons we didn't always acknowledge. Some of them were practical: money, responsibilities, the quiet chains of routine that wrapped around our ankles before we even realized we were tethered. But some were harder to name, more insidious. Fear, maybe. Or inertia. Or the way the world outside our small town never seemed quite real, never seemed like something we could truly touch. So we filled our days with distractions, with small rebellions against the boredom. Drinking on back porches, driving down empty roads with the windows down and the music too loud, pretending we were somewhere else, someone else. We played games with our own limits, with the limits of others, testing, pushing just to see where the edge was, just to prove to ourselves that we could still feel something. But external influences shape us more than we like to admit. They seep into our thoughts, our choices, turning the things we tell ourselves we would never do into things we consider, things we entertain, things that suddenly don't seem so impossible. The things we surround ourselves with: people, ideas, circumstances bend us, subtly or drastically, until we become something we never expected. Anna understood this better than anyone. She was always the one who could read the shift in the air before I felt it, who could sense when the weight of a moment was pulling us towards something irreversible. And yet, she never pulled back. If anything, she leaned into it. "It's not our fault we're like this," she said one evening, lying on the hood of my car, staring up at the sky. "We were made this way. Raised in a place that keeps people small, gives them just enough to survive, but never enough to escape." I sat beside her, the metal beneath me still warm from the day's sun. "You make it sound like a conspiracy," she smirked. "Maybe it is." I didn't argue, because I knew what she meant. There was something about the town, about the lives we had been expected to live, that felt like a trap. It was in the way our parents talked about the future, as if it were already decided. In the way people settled, not because they wanted to, but because it was easier than fighting for something else. In the way dreams started to shrink the longer you stayed. "You ever think about how different we'd be if we grew up somewhere else?" I asked. Anna turned her head toward me, her expression unreadable. "You mean if we didn't have to make our own fun?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Something like that." She sighed, turning back to the sky. "I don't know. Maybe we'd be boring. Maybe. Or maybe we would have never felt the need to push so hard, to test so much. Maybe we would have been content. But contentment wasn't something we knew how to hold. That summer, the external influences pressing down on us were heavier than ever. It wasn't just the town or the monotony or the slow, creeping realization that we weren't as different as we had always believed. It was the way everything seemed to be shifting around us, the way the things that used to feel safe now felt fragile, breakable. My parents were gone more often than not, their absence leaving the house feeling cavernous, filled with too much space and too much quiet. Anna's family had their own problems, ones she didn't like to talk about, but that I could see in the way she clenched her jaw, in the way she carried herself like she was always preparing for a fight. And then there was the heat, the relentless, suffocating summer heat that made everything feel heavier, like the world itself was pressing down on us. We spent more time outside because of it, sprawled in the grass, moving as little as possible, letting the sun bake our skin, making lazy conversation about nothing and everything. And Max was always there, a steady presence in a world that felt increasingly unsteady. Did you ever think about how animals don't have to deal with any of this? Anna asked one day, propping herself up on her elbows, watching as Max rolled onto his back, paws in the air. Deal with what? I asked. She gestured vaguely. Life. The way people expect things from us. The way we expect things from ourselves. I considered that. I think they just take things as they come. Anna hummed in agreement. Maybe that's why we like them so much. Max let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping against the grass. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath my touch. Maybe. But people weren't animals. We didn't just take things as they came. We thought. We worried. We let outside forces shape us in ways we couldn't always control. And that summer, those forces were pushing us towards something neither of us fully understood. It was in the way Anna kept looking for the next thrill, the next thing to make her feel something. It was in the way I followed, even when I wasn't sure I wanted to. It was in the way the nights stretched too long and the way the silences between us grew heavier, filled with something neither of us wanted to name. Maybe if we had been somewhere else, things would have been different. Maybe if we had been different people, we wouldn't have felt the need to test every limit, to cross every line just to see if it was real. But we weren't. And that summer, with the heat pressing down and the weight of all the things we didn't say settling in our chests, we were running out of limits to test. And I wasn't sure what we would do once we found the last one. The night after everything changed, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to move, unable to sleep, unable to reconcile the person I had been yesterday with the person I had become today. The air in my room felt different, thicker somehow, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me, suffocating me in a way they never had before. My sheets, once familiar and comforting, felt foreign against my skin, like they belonged to someone else, like I belonged to someone else. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, filled with the echoes of thoughts I didn't want to think, with the weight of something I couldn't name. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional creak of the floorboards shifting under the changing temperature. The sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven, was the loudest of all. I turned onto my side, pressing my forehead against the pillow, squeezing my eyes shut. Maybe if I just lay still long enough, the world would right itself. Maybe if I forced myself to be small, to take up less space, I could shrink this feeling, could make it something manageable, something I could tuck away in the back of my mind and pretend wasn't there. But it was there. There. It was in the way my body still remembered sensations I wanted to forget. It was in the way my mind kept replaying everything, over and over, dissecting it, reliving it, trying to make sense of something that had no logic, no explanation. I could still feel the heat of the sun on my skin from earlier that day, the rough texture of the grass beneath my fingers, the faint scent of beer and sweat and something else, something indescribable. My stomach twisted a slow, rolling nausea that made me press my palm against it, as if I could will it away. I wanted to feel disgust. I should have felt disgust. Instead, all I felt was hollow. It was a different kind of emptiness than I had known before. Not the kind that came with boredom, or loneliness, or longing. This was something deeper, something more insidious. A void that stretched wide and endless inside me, swallowing everything else. Anna had left hours ago. She hadn't said much before she walked out the door, her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate, careful. As if she was afraid that if she moved too fast, if she acknowledged what had just happened, the world would break apart around her. I hadn't stopped her. I hadn't asked her to stay. I wasn't sure what I would have said if I had. Now lying alone in my darkened bedroom, I wondered if she was lying in hers, staring at her own ceiling, feeling the same thing I was, or if she had already found a way to lock it away, to bury it beneath layers of justification and distraction, the way she always did. I wished I could do the same. Instead, I let the memories run their course. Let them unravel inside me, raw and unfiltered, because fighting them only made them stronger. The worst part wasn't the moment itself. It wasn't even the aftermath. It was the realization that despite everything, despite the part of me that knew we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, a part of me didn't regret it. That was the thought that terrified me the most. I rolled onto my back again, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to force the thoughts away, trying to replace them with something, anything else. But my mind wouldn't let go. I thought about the way Anna had looked at me before it happened. The way her expression had shifted, the way something unspoken had passed between us. The way she had known I wouldn't stop her, that I wouldn't stop myself. Had I wanted it to happen? No. Yes. Maybe. I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that something inside me had changed. Something fundamental. I felt different. Not just emotionally, but physically. As if my body wasn't entirely my own anymore, as if it had been altered, as if the boundary between who I was before and who I was now had been erased in an instant. I sat up suddenly, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, my breath coming fast and shallow. The air in my room was too heavy, too thick. I needed to move, needed to do something, needed to remind myself that I was still here, still me. I pushed myself to my feet, my body protesting the sudden movement. My head spun slightly, my limbs felt unsteady, like I had been awake for days instead of just one night. The house felt impossibly quiet as I made my way downstairs. Max was still in the living room, lying on his side, his breathing deep and even. I stopped in the doorway, watching him for a long moment, feeling something twist inside me. He had no idea. None of this meant anything to him. I envied him for that. I swallowed hard and stepped past him, into the kitchen. The tile was cold against my bare feet, grounding me slightly. I poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands, taking slow, measured sips, trying to force my body to calm down. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was making it worse by thinking about it so much. But how was I supposed to not think about it? How was I supposed to pretend that today had been just another ordinary summer afternoon, that everything hadn't shifted beneath my feet, changing shape before I could stop it? I set the glass down on the counter, pressing my palms against the cool surface, gripping the edge like it could hold me in place. What now? What was I supposed to do now? Tomorrow would come. The sun would rise. The world would keep turning, indifferent to the fact that mine had been thrown off its axis. Anna and I would have to see each other again. Would we talk about it? Or would we pretend it never happened? I wasn't sure which option scared me more. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. I needed to sleep. I needed to shut my mind off, just for a little while. But as I climbed the stairs and slipped back into bed, I already knew I wouldn't. I already knew that, no matter how much I tried to silence my thoughts, the memory of today would play on a loop in my head, relentless and unforgiving. And worst of all, I knew that this wasn't the end of it. Because no matter how much I told myself otherwise, no matter how much I tried to push it down, I couldn't ignore the truth. A part of me wanted to do it again. The days that followed were filled with a strange, heavy silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but something deeper, something unspoken that pressed against my chest and settled into my bones. I moved through the motions of my routine, waking up, making coffee, taking Bailey for a walk, but everything felt distant, like I was watching my life from behind glass. Anna and I didn't talk about what had happened. At first, I thought maybe she would bring it up, that she would make some offhand comment, her usual way of diffusing tension with humor. But she didn't. And I didn't either. Instead, we let it hang between us, an invisible presence, lingering in every pause, in every glance that lasted a second too long. I told myself that it was better this way. That if we didn't speak about it, if we didn't give it a name, then maybe it would fade into the background, into the long list of things we had done, and then quietly buried. But I knew, deep down, that this was different. This wasn't just another boundary pushed, another rule bent. This was something that had shaken me in a way I hadn't expected, something that made me question things I wasn't ready to face. One evening, as I sat on the couch with Bailey curled up beside me, I tried to piece together my thoughts, to understand the storm of emotions swirling inside me. There was guilt, of course, a heavy, gnawing thing that sat low in my stomach. But there was also curiosity, A quiet voice in the back of my mind that asked questions I didn't want to answer. Where was the line? And had I already crossed it? I had always believed that people were defined by their choices, by the things they did when no one was watching. That morality wasn't just about right and wrong, but about intention, about understanding the weight of your own actions. And yet, as I sat there in the dim light of my living room, running my fingers absently through Bailey's fur, I realized I wasn't sure where I stood anymore. Was it possible to be both guilty and unashamed? To regret something and yet not wish to take it back? I leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. Anna had always believed that morality was flexible, that people invented rules to keep themselves from facing their own desires. Good and bad are just words, she had told me once years ago when we were still teenagers. People decide what they mean. I had agreed with her then, had liked the simplicity of it, the idea that we could shape our own realities. But now I wasn't so sure. Because if morality was just a construct, then why did I feel like something inside me had shifted? Why did I feel like I had changed in some fundamental way? I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was just another moment in a long string of moments, another experience that would fade with time. Maybe in a week or a month or a year I would look back and wonder why I had let it consume me. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe this was the kind of thing that stayed with you. The kind of thing that whispered in the quiet moments, reminding you that there are some boundaries you don't come back from. The weight of my thoughts had grown heavier in the days that followed, settling over me like a dense fog that refused to lift. It wasn't just the immediate aftermath of what had happened, it was something more. Something that reached deeper than the event itself. I found myself staring into space for long stretches of time, my mind looping around the same questions, searching for answers that refused to come. What defines the boundaries we set for ourselves? Are they dictated by society, by culture, by the expectations drilled into us from childhood? Or are they innate, something woven into our very being, guiding us toward an invisible moral compass that we don't fully understand? If rules exist simply because we agree to follow them, what happens when we step outside those agreements? Does the world break? Or does it continue, unbothered, indifferent to the choices we make? I had always believed in free will, in the idea that we shape our own reality through the decisions we make. But now, for the first time, I wondered if that belief had been a comfortable illusion. If we were all just the product of unseen forces, biology, psychology, society pushing us toward paths we thought we had chosen. Bailey lay at my feet as I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees. His breathing was steady, his presence grounding in a way that human connection often failed to be. He didn't question his choices. He didn't struggle with morality, didn't spiral into existential doubt over the nature of right and wrong. He simply was. And yet, even in his simplicity, he obeyed rules. Invisible ones. Ones he had learned through experience, through instinct, through the subtle guidance of the world around him. He didn't run into traffic. He didn't bite unless provoked. He trusted because trust had been rewarded. He feared because fear once been necessary. Did he ever question those instincts? Did he ever wonder if the rules that governed his world were arbitrary? Or was it just us, just humans who struggled under the weight of their own self-awareness, burdened by the constant need to assign meaning to things that simply were? I ran my fingers through Bailey's fur absent-mindedly, my thoughts spiraling deeper. We like to believe we are in control of ourselves, that our choices are conscious, deliberate, that we weigh the consequences before we act, that we are governed by logic and morality rather than impulse. But if that were true, then why do so many of our decisions feel as though they are made for us, dictated by forces we cannot name? Desire, fear, curiosity. Do we make choices, or do choices make us? I thought about Anna, about the way she had always seemed to exist outside of rules, outside of expectation. She had once told me that the only real difference between right and wrong was whether or not you were willing to live with the consequences. I had laughed then, thinking it was just another one of her many provocations, a way to challenge the rigid beliefs of the people around her. Now I wasn't sure if she had been joking. If morality is fluid, then does it have any real meaning at all? Or do we simply define it in hindsight, using guilt or justification as a measuring stick? I exhaled, rubbing my temples. The human mind is a strange, contradictory thing. We crave freedom, but we also crave structure. We push against rules, but we panic when they are removed. We tell ourselves we want to explore the unknown, but when we finally do, we realize we were more comfortable with the certainty of our limitations. But is this what it meant to grow up? To realize that the world was not black and white, but an endless shade of gray? And if so, did that make life more liberating or more terrifying? Bailey let out a soft sigh, nudging my leg with his nose as if sensing the storm of thoughts running through me. I gave him a small smile, scratching behind his ears. Maybe the answer wasn't as complicated as I was making it. Maybe boundaries exist not because they are necessary, but because they give us something to push against. Because without them, we are left to face the terrifying vastness of infinite possibility. And maybe the greatest philosophical dilemma isn't whether rules exist, but whether we can ever truly live without them.